All houses wherein men have lived and died are haunted houses. Through the open doors the harmless phantoms on their errands glide, with feet that make no sound upon the floors. We meet them at the doorway, on the stair, along the passages they come and go. Impalpable impressions on the air, a sense of something moving to and fro. There are more guests at the table than the hosts invited. The illuminated hall is thronged with quiet, inoffensive ghosts, as silent as the pictures on the wall. From the poem Haunted Houses by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow.
I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey lurkers, welcome to this week's episode. This week we're going to be hopping across the pond again to explore the historic Chillingham Castle in Northumberland in England, near the border with Scotland. This castle is aptly named because both the history and the hauntings are nothing short of chilling. But I don't think that's how it got its name. Actually, I know how it got its name, and it's named after the town of Chillingham where it's actually located. It has gained fame throughout the world for its bloody past and the shocking deeds that have been carried out within its walls. Because of this, I do want to put a disclaimer here. I did not mark the episode explicit because I try to be careful about descriptions, but I am going to be mentioning some medieval torture and a non-detailed account of some sexual violence. You don't need the details. This isn't a true crime podcast. It's paranormal. So you only have enough information to understand the origin of the haunting. But I do want to warn anybody with younger children. I try to keep the podcast PG as much as possible. This one might be headed slightly more into PG-13 territory. Though I'll be honest, I'm old and I really have no clue what constitutes those ratings in this new era anymore. Use your own judgment. Chillingham is an intact medieval castle. It was built in the 12th century as a monastery. Its location was ideal for a defensive strategy during the border wars between Scotland and England. Its clear view from all sides meant attackers would not go unnoticed. It has been home to the Grey family and their descendants since 1246. In 1296, a Scottish raid destroyed the original manor house, which may have been replaced by a tower house, which forms one of the 4 corner towers today. Several monarchs have visited Chillingham. King Henry III visited Chillingham in 1245, followed in 1298 by King Edward I, also known as the Hammer of the Scots, while on his way north to confront William Wallace in battle. William Wallace, if you don't know, also went by the name Braveheart, and he looks a lot like Mel Gibson. I made that last part up. I don't really know what he looked like. James I also visited the castle, and in the 1600s, Charles I, who was famous for his leadership of the Cavaliers during their battles with Oliver Cromwell's Roundheads, stayed there for 3 nights just before he was imprisoned and executed at Whitehall in London. After Sir Thomas de Heaton gained a license to crenellate in 1344, Chillingham became a fully fortified castle, complete with dungeons and a torture chamber. His castle adopted a quadrangular design with massive towers at the 4 corners, a style rarely found in Northumberland. The castle has undergone many changes in subsequent centuries. Chillingham suffered damage during the years of the Pilgrimage of Grace, which probably resulted in the rebuilding of some of the towers. It was refurbished and redeveloped in Tudor and Stuart times. At its center is the Great Hall, an Elizabethan chamber overlooked by a medieval minstrel's gallery. Work on redeveloping the north range of the castle took place in 1610, possibly under the direction of Inigo Jones, although that is not proven. I don't think he's any relation to Inigo Montoya, but if you have 6 fingers, I'd step lightly around Chillingham. 5 million points to the first person who messages me knowing what that reference is from. But the points really don't mean anything. One of the cool things about Chillingham is the wild white cattle on its 600-acre property. They have lived there since at least 1220, when the park wall was erected. Or rather, these are the descendants of the cattle that lived there in 1220. I don't think the cattle are 800 years old. They may have lived there for centuries before 1220. Chillingham cattle were hunted in medieval times, but today they live freely in the park, watched over by a warden. They are never handled and indeed have no human intervention in their lives. They are the only surviving herd of actual wild cattle in the world. Their population was once considerable in the forests of England. Pre-Christian pagans were said to sacrifice them, and they were highly regarded and considered sacred. Today they are considered to be potentially dangerous, so the public is advised not to approach them without the supervision of the cattle warden. Similar to the Yellowstone buffalo, don't pet the fluffy cows. As far as the family of Chillingham, the current owner is Sir Edward Humphrey Tyrrell Wakefield, who was a baronet. Sir Humphrey purchased the castle lands, but was gifted the castle, as it has never been sold in its history. It has been owned for centuries by Sir Humphrey's wife's family, the ancient and noble Grey family. For you tea drinkers out there was once a part of the Chillingham estate called Howick Hall, and it was in Howick Hall that the Prime Minister, Earl Grey, was served the famous tea blend now named for him. Personally, I'm rather partial to the Irish breakfast tea myself. Sir Humphrey holds a lot of titles and memberships to include President of the Northumberland Mountain Rescue Services, former Chairman of the International Wilderness Foundation, and Fellow of London's Royal Geographical Society. But enough with the history, let's get on with the hauntings. We're going to go room by room and look at the hauntings in that particular room or area of the castle. First up is the room known as the Pink Room. The Pink Room is part of Sir Humphrey's private quarters and is only available for family or private guests. The room is located high in the northwest tower and is associated with tragedy that went undiscovered until restoration was done in the 1900s. The previous occupant of Chillingham was Lady Leonora Tankerville. She lived in the castle during the 1920s and was known to be quite fond of the Pink Room. The room has some magnificent views which might explain her fondness. Lady Tankerville spent a great deal of time in the Pink Room, and then, late at night, the haunting started. As the tower clock struck midnight, and the last of the chimes died away, an eerie silence would fall on the room. It was a silence so quiet and unnatural, it was said to chill you to your bones. Then, suddenly, the silence would be broken by muffled cries of a child that grew louder and more disturbing with each cry. The shrieks and wails would become so unbearable that whoever was attempting to sleep in the room was forced to hold their ears for relief. The sound was always described as a child in agony or great fear. Eventually, the cries would die away, leaving the room's occupant distressed. But it didn't end there. Next, a bright halo of light would emerge from the old fireplace and approach the bed. Within the calming blue light was the figure of a young boy dressed in old blue clothing. He would go to whoever was in the bed and reach out his arm looking for comfort before vanishing as quickly as he'd come. Though most people would think twice before returning to the room, Lady Tankerville returned each evening and witnessed the haunting regularly, hoping to figure out what the young ghost wanted. She hoped he might speak to her, though he never actually did. Lady Tankerville kept a diary of the boy's visits, spanning over a long period. Eventually, restoration was done to that area of the castle, and a gruesome discovery was made. A wall was knocked down in the pink room, and within the rubble were the remains of a young boy and fragments of blue clothing. The clothing was identified as being from the time period of when Charles I was on the throne, dating the boy's death to sometime in the mid-1600s. The boy's identity still remains a mystery. His remains were given a proper burial, and the haunting ceased until recent years. Guests in the pink room now report being woken in the middle of the night by flashes of blue light near the fireplace. Others report that when they are looking in a certain mirror in the room, a child's handprint appears before slowly fading away. Next up is the Castle Chapel. This space is a traditional-looking chapel with an altar at the far end, a priest stand, and a crucifix on the far left wall. The pews are set in 2 rows facing the altar, with an aisle that leads between them to the front of the chapel. There is 1 window above the altar that looks out over the back lawn and fountain. There are 2 entrances, one leading from the Great Hall, the other from the area called the Minstrel's Gallery. The chapel is famous for its cold spot, which is found right next to the priest stand. Even at the hottest part of summer, the cold spot will remain. The room has been checked many times for drafts or possible wind tunnel to explain the cold spot, but nothing has been discovered. People have also reported feeling a sense of dread when standing next to the priest stand where the cold spot is located. Other people describe the feeling of the hairs on the back of their necks standing on end and an increase in anxiety. The chapel is also known for a haunting associated with a woman named Eleanor. Eleanor has been sighted often, sitting in the pews near the altar. She turns to look at visitors walking into the room. Her face is full of sorrow, and then she simply vanishes. Eleanor is a young girl, approximately around the age of 9. She is thought to have been a prisoner at the castle during the border wars between England and Scotland. After days of ill treatment by the soldiers, she was said to have crawled into the chapel and died near the priest stand. I don't even want to imagine what kind of treatment by the soldiers. Visitors have also heard a child whisper in the chapel, and others have said they felt their clothes being tugged on, as though a child was trying to get their attention. Those who visit, who are also sensitive to the dead, have seen Eleanor and say that she is a short girl wearing a dirty white dress with dark brown matted hair. She has a pale complexion, and her expression makes her look like she's in a state of desperation. But Eleanor isn't the only ghost in the chapel. Visitors have reported seeing an old priest walking around the room. And, just to clear it up, a priest stand, I'm pretty sure, is simply put nothing more than a podium. Maybe a fancy podium for a priest. We're now going to move to the Great Hall. The Great Hall remains much the same as it was centuries ago when it was used for banquets and celebrations. It's used for basically the same purposes today. In the Great Hall, there is an old table that stretches nearly the length of the room. At the end of the room is an ancient tapestry depicting a battle scene. Opposite the banquet table, there is an old stone fireplace that is huge, large enough to be able to heat such a large space. There are many artifacts in the room, including weapons. On the table is one interesting item. It's a piece of wood that has been reinforced with strips of steel on the sides. The weapon forms a Y, and it was taken into battle, but it wasn't used during the battle. It's called a priest stick, and a holy man would walk the battlefield looking for injured soldiers who were beyond medical help and dying a slow and painful death. The holy man would mutter a prayer and smash the club over the head of the injured man until he was dead. The priest would then make a notch in the wood, keeping a tally of all the men that were killed, and they would be prayed for at a later date. Because of all these weapons of battle, it's no wonder the room is haunted. Many have said to have heard heavy footsteps echoing around the room. When the noise was investigated, there was no one there who could be making the noise. Chairs also move in the Great Hall. During a guided tour, the guide was explaining how a particular weapon would have been used when suddenly one of the chairs from the banquet table at the far end of the room, closest to the chapel, scraped along the floor about 2 feet before coming to a stop. The group turned after being startled by the noise and found the chair sitting in the middle of the room. Another regular occurrence is the throwing of objects. Previous caretakers have said that when they are locking the Great Hall up at night, objects from the table, like cups, goblets, and plates, have been thrown and hit the caretakers on the back as they're about to leave the room. When they turn to try to catch the culprit, they find that the room is completely empty. In Chillingham Castle, there is also a room known as the Edward I room, and it's the most ancient room in the castle. Aristocratic visitors spent a great deal of time in this room because its location made it safe from potential attack, and it had great views of the hills and gardens. It also acted as a great watchtower. It's of course named after Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, who stayed there on his way to attack William Wallace. King Henry III is also reputed to have stayed there in 1245. The room was restored in a way so that it represents its original standing in the 13th century. Along with suits of armor, weaponry, and a banquet table, the original crenellation papers are on display. These papers basically gave permission, granted by royalty, to begin building battlements, and it was issued in 1344. This is the only license to crenellate that is actually in its castle of origin. The Edward I room has a secret compartment to the right of the north window that contained a metal box with documents, some of which date back to the Spanish Armada. The Gothic window was installed in 1298 and is intact today. Guests report feelings of dread and despair, and it's suggested that these may be the feelings of the royals of years gone by. People also hear muffled conversations that seem to escalate into anger. It's not possible to understand what the voices are saying, though given the importance of the room, it's possible they're discussing long-ago battle plans. The next spot is an area called the Minstrel's Hall or Gallery. The area is connected to the chapel by a passageway leading up to some stone stairs. Back in the day, the minstrels would gather on the balcony and play music for the guests below in the area that is now known as the tea room. People have seen shadow figures on the balcony that slowly walk into the chapel before disappearing. One visitor said that while he was admiring the tea room, he noticed a man leaning against the balcony of the minstrels' gallery. The man was wearing what looked like a white Edwardian shirt with black riding boots. He stood up there glaring before turning and walking to the stairs that led to the chapel. The oddest thing was, the man made no sound. It would be impossible to silence bootsteps on the floor, but somehow this man managed complete silence. The visitors summoned the courage to run up the balcony and into the chapel to see where the man went, but no one was there. I can attest that the visitors showed more chutzpah than I, without a doubt. Then again, maybe, I don't know. I guess it would depend on who was with me as far as whether or not I might run after what's probably a ghost. I'd like to think that I would have the cojones to run after a ghost. I don't know. This particular room, the tea room, also has a hidden secret. A sealed-off space that was once a torture chamber. The original entrance to this chamber is hidden behind a large stone fireplace next to a window that looks over the courtyard. The chamber is directly under the floors of the tea room, and to get to it, you would have to walk down a spiral stone staircase where the fireplace is now. As a fundraiser for charity, someone organized a seance at Chillingham, and it was set up in view of the minstrel's hall. It began as most seances do, with everyone seated around the table, holding hands, and the person leading the seance asking the spirits to make contact. The room grew eerily quiet, and suddenly the temperature in the room dropped so low that the breath of the participants started to condense. The candle flame began to flicker at first, then danced wildly, growing taller, then shorter, and then appeared as though someone was blowing on the flame, blowing on it but not quite blowing it out. While most were watching the antics of the candle, others noticed a shadow move in the balcony that moved up the steps and into the chapel. After the terrified guests were calmed and the balcony checked for intruders, I find this incredibly humorous. You're having a seance in a highly haunted location, asking spirits to show up, and you think there's an intruder. But guess what? There was no intruder found. Imagine that. The witnesses said that the shadow appeared to be very tall, over 6 feet, and had broad shoulders. Many felt this was the apparition of John Sage, who was a large man and known for his cruelty. By the way, the torture chamber that is hidden by the fireplace was his torture chamber. Not his as in he was tortured there, but his as he was the torturer. So the seance leader decides that trying to summon the spirit of incredibly evil John Sage is an excellent idea. After his summons, the candle begins its wild dancing before going out suddenly, as though someone pinched the flame. The room is shrouded in complete darkness. The atmosphere of the room was oppressive, and the cold nearly unbearable. Oh, and by the way, this is taking place in mid-August. It was actually humid and quite warm outside. Finally, someone has the sense to turn on a flashlight and go over and turn on the light in the room, and everyone is now relieved. One of the participants in the seance had also been recording, in the hopes of recording something otherworldly. Upon reviewing the tape, when the candle went out and someone asked what happened to the candle, there was silence, and then an incredibly loud roar. The group was silent, and then, without a word, everyone gathered their things and left the castle. We're going to get back to John Sage here shortly. First, we're going to continue checking out the other areas of the castle. There's an area known as the inner pantry, where a frail figure in white appears. The castle treasures were stored in this area, and the person in charge of guarding it slept in the room. The legend says that one night, after the guard had settled into bed, a lady in white woke him. She looked ill, and she asked him for a cup of water. Thinking it was a castle guest, the guard turned to fill a cup with water, and then realized that he had locked himself in the room, and the key was actually hanging around his neck, and no one could have entered the room. He turned, and he found himself alone in the room. Others have seen the same apparition of the pale woman. Some think she may have been a victim of poison. In the newer part of the castle is the area known as the dairy, because, well, it was the castle's dairy. It's suggested that it might have also served as some sort of nursery, because guests are disturbed at night by shrill cries of a young newborn baby. The cries go on for a bit before eventually fading away. Within the castle is an apartment of sorts known as the Grey Room that is actually available for rent by the public. It has 2 bedrooms that lead into a passageway or hallway that connects to a long gallery. In the Grey Room is a painting of Lady Mary Berkeley, who was a former castle resident. She was left alone in the castle for many years, with just her infant daughter as a companion, while her husband had affairs and eventually left her for her sister. Her portrait originally hung in the area that was the nursery before being moved to the Grey Room. The stories say that Lady Berkeley would step out of her painting and wander around the nursery when it had been hung in there. The children and nurses were terrified, and the portrait was eventually moved. But people have reported seeing her roaming around the Grey Room as well, though with less frequency. They've also reported hearing the sounds of a woman sobbing at night. One visitor's account of their stay in the Grey Room stated that they settled into bed around 11 p.m. and almost immediately heard a loud knocking noise coming from the gallery. It sounded like someone was banging on the table. The sounds grew louder and louder, echoing around the gallery room. Then the noise suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening. Then the knocking started again, louder and quicker than before. The sounds began moving from the gallery into the hallway. It was accompanied by the sound of heavy boots on the floor and grew louder, getting closer to the bedroom doors. Their eyes were fixed on the door, expecting someone to burst through at any moment, and then again, it was silent. The silence was broken by the sound of a child laughing, and then the pounding started back up and moved back down the hall to the gallery, and then slammed the door when it left. It's not just the rooms within the castle that are haunted. There are a couple of locations on the castle property that also have strange things going on. Down an old gravel path, a little ways away from the castle, sits the caretaker's cottage. Late one night, in a heavy storm, the caretaker heard the bell ring outside just as he was going to bed. He went to the door and carefully opened it to find a woman wearing an old cloak with the hood up and obscuring her face. She slowly lifted her arm, and the caretaker noticed she was holding a letter. Startled, the caretaker moved to the side of the door to switch on the porch light, and when he moved back to the door, the figure was gone. The current caretakers are plagued at night by knocks at the door and the bell ringing. Situated deep in the ancient oak trees between the caretaker's cottage and the castle's main entrance is what is called the Monk's Trail. This was the original site of the monastery, and all that now remains is the stone arch that is said to have been one of the doorways. The monks disagreed with the brutality and torture that was inflicted on the enemies of the castle, and the monks would try to intervene when they could by cutting down newly hung prisoners from the trees before they met their gruesome end. They would also rescue those who were hung in the trees in such a way that they were experiencing unbearable and painful stressful positions on their joints. Many times the rescue plots of the monks were thwarted by soldiers on night duty. The monks were then sentenced to horrific torture within the torture chamber, followed by execution by hanging. The monks were forced to stand beneath the trees, place the noose around their own neck, and then they were hoisted in the air to choke to death. There are many reports of apparitions in the area. Guests catch glimpses of hooded men wandering amongst the trees with looks of despair on their faces. And that pleasant story is going to bring us back to John Sage and the torture chamber that I mentioned before. Here's where there's a little bit more detail about torture and whatnot. John Sage, as I mentioned briefly, was an evil man. He was a former lieutenant who became injured in the leg by a spear. His lower tendons were severed during a gruesome battle with the Scottish rebels. He then became known as Dragfoot for obvious reasons. Once he suffered the injury, he was no longer needed in battle, so he was transferred to Chillingham Castle to be the head torturer. John Sage lusted over the suffering and misery of others. Resentful of the Scots who inflicted his injury, he invented torture devices that would inflict as much pain as possible. It's claimed that he tortured at least 50 Scottish enemies each week. He liked to go to the dungeon and drag out his next victims. Those left in the cell were forced to listen to the screams from the chamber below, knowing their turn would be coming. Some waiting prisoners tried to kill themselves before John Sage could get to them by smashing their own heads into the stone walls of their cell. It was more merciful than anything waiting for them in the chamber below. John Sage's enthusiasm is what ended up bringing an end to his terror-filled reign. He had a lover named Elizabeth Charlton, who came to visit just as he was locking up the dungeons for the night. Apparently the two started to get hot and heavy, and they decided to participate in acts of debauchery within the torture chamber itself. Sage ended up placing Elizabeth on one of his favorite devices, the rack, and began to uncontrollably strangle her at the height of pleasure. If you get my meaning. He ended up strangling Elizabeth to death before he came to his senses. Elizabeth's father was a clan leader and outlaw and managed to get information on just how his daughter died, and he wanted John Sage executed, or he would join in an attack on the castle with the Scots. The order was agreed to, and John Sage was brutally hanged in the castle grounds. He was hoisted above the ground, and as he choked, people began to slice and hack pieces of his body, including nose, toes, and testicles. That sounds like a bad children's song. Testicles, nose and toes, nose and toes. Anyway, John Sage's spirit, as we mentioned before, is active within the castle. Many have reported seeing his apparition, a tall, strongly built man with jet black beard, walking around the castle's many rooms. There are no known portraits of Sage, so it's hard to say exactly what he looked like, but the biggest clue to the ghost's identity is that the ghost is seen walking with a heavy limp, and there's the sound of one footstep, followed by a long scrape on the stone floor. And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed our little trip across the pond to Chillingham Castle. Remember, you can find episodes of Lurk wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, or at lurkpodcast.com. On the website, you can also find links to our social media accounts. Also, there is a raffle going on, sponsored by So Sci-Fi and Beyond. They are raffling off a Bigfoot lap quilt valued at $225. Details can be found on the Lurk Facebook page. Tickets are 2 for $5 or 5 for $10, and all the money raised goes to help my daughter, who you might remember I mentioned was in a serious ATV accident several months ago. So for more information on that and how to get raffle tickets, head on over to the Facebook page. Or you can email me at lurkpodcast@yahoo.com. If you like what you hear, tell your friends, or take a moment and give us a 5-star review. And until next time, keep lurking.